Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar today. My name is Rosalie Ganawan, and I'm the Education and Public Programs Manager at the Chinese Canadian Museum. For those of you who may be attending your first webinar hosted by us, the Chinese Canadian Museum is located in Vancouver, Chinatown, on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We invite you all to reflect on the histories of the host nations that you're on and learn a little bit more about local histories and the ways that colonialism has impacted and shaped the world that we live in. So I'm very excited to have this panel here today. The program is, we're calling this program Tracing Your Ancestral Roots and Heritage. And it's really appropriately timed in that the Qingming Festival is on April 4th this year. Qingming is also known as the Tomb Sweeping Festival, and it's the time to honor and pay respects to our ancestors. And as a way of connecting those with our ancestors and the ancestors of the Chinese Canadian community, I figured a good way to kind of explore that relationship is through some of the experiences of our great panelists here today who have traced their family villages and paid respects to their ancestors through this means. So we have Dr. Henry Yu here today, who has been the one who has organized many of these trips that have been going on through University of British Columbia. For those of you who are meeting Dr. Henry Yu for the first time, he is an associate professor in the Department of History, whose research focuses on the history of trans-Pacific migrations, especially with Chinese Canadian history. And he has been involved in many different capacities in engaging the Chinatown and Chinese Canadian community through I feel like there's too many different institutes to list off, to be honest, and there's so many different acronyms. But he's also one of the founding board members of the Chinese Canadian Museum, and we're very happy to have him here today to share some of his experiences and the initiative that he's created to have these village trips and research going on. And we also have 4 panels here today. Jimmy Chow, Peter Ham, Naomi Louie, and Melanie Ng, who have all participated in these trips, both before the pandemic and in the most recent iteration last November 2024. So before I turn it over to Henry to speak a little bit about these Kaiping village trips, just a few housekeeping things. So this webinar will be recorded and available publicly through our YouTube in a few days. So you can keep an eye out on our YouTube channel at CC Museum. And for anyone who has any questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A box. If you look at the bottom bar of your Zoom, there's the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring that throughout the chat, throughout the panel. So there'll be a chance at the end to have some of your questions answered. You can ask any questions broadly to all panelists or direct them at anyone in particular if their presentations spark any interest for you. So with that, Henry, would you like to say some words?
Great. Thanks, Rosalie. And thanks to the Chinese Canadian Museum for inviting me as well as all the other panelists to this. I'm just why I have a different background for everyone to know is I'm joining you from Japan, where I am at this particular moment. And for some reason, the background hasn't been able to travel over the Pacific to me. And so you've just got my curtain behind me. But well, I thought, the most interesting thing is to hear from the 4 folks who have gone on these trips and rather than me. But I thought I'd give a little background on how the trips came about and why they came about. So just for those who don't know much about me, I was born in Canada, born in Vancouver in 1967. And my parents had just arrived in Canada in 1965, just before I was born, from Hong Kong. But before that, they had come from China into Hong Kong in 1962. And my mother's side, there was four generations who had come to Canada. So my great grandfather came to Vancouver in the 1880s. My grandfather and his three brothers followed him, and we had lots and lots of relatives, all from Zhongshan County, uh, one of the eight counties in southern China, in Guangdong Province, that sent over 95% of those migrants who went all around the Pacific to Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii. They were almost all from just eight counties. Just to give you a sense of how strange that is, there's 1.5 billion plus people in China today. China is huge. And yet all these people going around the Pacific in the 19th century to all these different places were all coming from just eight counties. And that would be like everyone going around leaving what is now the area of the, not much larger than sort of southern British Columbia. And so if you think of it the other way, you know, rather than anywhere else. And the why of that is that it's a family network phenomenon. I'll give you a story just to illustrate sort of what that means. When I was young, I was in Vancouver. I was born in Vancouver General Hospital. I'm a Madeline Chung baby, delivered by Dr. Madeline Chung at Vancouver General Hospital. And when I was in the second grade, my father was a mining engineer at the time, and so I was in small towns like Hope, BC, and then I came back to Vancouver, and I was going to school and crossing Knight Street. For those in Vancouver, they'll know that Knight Street's like a busy, busy street, and I'd cross it four times a day, go to school, come back for lunch, go back, and I got hit by a car, almost inevitably, crossing Knight Street without lights. And then my mom said, let's go find the place with the least number of cars, that every relative who is now deployed, to find us a corner store. And why a corner store was because my mother's relatives all operated small corner stores. That was this niche economy of their family networks. And so they found us a store outside of Victoria, a place called Colwood, that had very low traffic and was across the street from the school. So I would never get hit by a car again. I tell this story because why did we go into stores? My father was a mining engineer, because of being able to be set up by relatives in a store. They found one, and according to the criteria needed. And then from then on, whenever I would, instead of going out and play after school with all the friends stuff, I would be working in the store after school, selling candy to all these kids and stuff. And then someone would come in and they would go, "Oh, you're Chinese. Do you know so and so?" And I think at that time I was a young teenager, really angry at the world, kind of going, "That's so racist. You think I'm Chinese, and then you ask me if I know some other Chinese person you know." And I always react in this kind of like, I was like, "Why are you asking me that?" The annoying thing was when they'd ask, and then I'd ask my mom or something, we did know those people. Like they'd be asking, "Oh, do you know so and so who in Nanaimo?" And we go, "Why do you ask me that?" And it's like, "Oh yeah, we do know that." Da, da, da. And so it seemed like everybody who was Chinese was related to us, or we knew through a relative, and that as just a way of explaining that the old migrants, these people from those eight counties, the several thousands of villages in the four counties regions, the three counties regions, Sze Yup, Sam Yup, Zhongshan, those eight, if you're from one of those, the chances that you're coming over to Canada, United States, New Zealand, Australia is going to be because of a pre-existing relative already over. A father, an uncle, a brother, a village, a person from the same village, but not directly related to you, but a third cousin, or something like that. And that's why we can do these village visits, because for the Wakyu, the old overseas Chinese, before the 1960s, before people started to come from other parts of Southeast Asia and around the world, and now people come from every part of China and every part of the world who are ethnic Chinese. But before the 1970s, which was really when I was a kid in Colwood, people were connected to each other. And it's because of that that we can trace back to these, again, 4,000 villages in these 8 counties. And that's where I had the chance in 1982, when I was a 15-year-old, to go back with my grandmother and meet relatives and go to my grandmother's villages, my grandfather's village, my all these different villages that I had relations in. And that was a transformative experience for me. And it's something I've never forgotten, that it shaped my life as a 15-year-old. You could say that I became a historian studying migration because of that experience of my own sort of meeting and realizing that I'm tied to all these people. And so that really is the genesis of the Village Roots trips. I mean, we began 15 years ago, uh, basically with some students, and then we had some quote adult trips. My students are adults, or they're in their 20s, but Jimmy went on one of those, and so I'm really happy to see Jimmy here. And then the most recent one in November, Naomi, Peter, and Melanie all came along as well. And so that's really the genesis. Why we do it is I everybody will have a different experience. Not everybody will have the same experience, say, I had when I was a 15-year-old in 1982. And in 1982, at the time, China was just reopening. We could do it because it was actually the first year that my grandmother could get us and take her grandkids to kind of meet the relatives and show everyone the village. That was a different world. That was before China became the modern China over the last 40 years it has. And so we're going back to a different China than it was in the 1980s. But still, there's something about finding your roots that you're going to hear from the others. And I know a lot of people, as I look at the names, a lot of you have done family history research on your own family. You've interviewed people on this side, if you can. You've looked up records. And there's something about being in the village itself and meeting someone who kind of vaguely looks like one of the uncles in Canada, or and I know there's lots of fear and trepidation as well. A lot of people, their relatives lost land in the 1950s, or there's been a lot of breakage, or there's distrust, or relationships went. So I am. We're also aware that often there's a great amount of wariness and trepidation before going, and which again is why I'm so thankful to Rosalie and the Chinese Canadian Museum for putting together this panel so you can hear everyone hears own sort of personal stories of what they discovered and how in the end, I think, and I'll kind of stop here and pass it on, that one of the reasons that's so rewarding for me to go on these, and they're a lot of work. We partner with researchers on the China side at Wu University. My colleague, Dr. Celia Tan, who is the lead researcher for the UNESCO World Heritage Site designation for Kaiping or Hoiping. And so they are fantastic, but it's a lot of work for them. And so we are trying to actually create a more effective, efficient way to do this. And so some of the folks who went on this last trip in November are actually right now busily trying to create a model where we can do this, in a repeated way. But I hope we can. And I hope we can really find a way for other people to experience this. And I'll say there is a sunset kind of point at which we won't be able to do this anymore. As the last of the village elders who knew people who left or who were related to, who can remember those out migrations that really were cut off, if you recall, by the 1923 Exclusion Act, but also even after they resumed, when the Exclusion Act was ended in 1947, there was only a period of another decade and a half or so where people like my mother could join relatives from those places. And so, as the last of the elders there, um, basically forget, and the memories of the people who left pass with them. It's not a long window, and so for those of you who are thinking about doing this, um, yeah, there is a way in which we'll lose that personal contact eventually. But I'm going to pass it back to Rosalie to kind of yeah uh, let us hear from everyone else, and I'm eager to hear also from Peter and Jimmy and Melanie and Naomi, because I really had the privilege of being in you know in China with them, and so
Yeah, thank you for that, Henry. So yeah, I'm going to pass it on to our panelists now to share a little bit about their experiences. So if each of you can, maybe give a brief introduction to yourself, the year that you went on one of the village trips, and the names of the villages that you visited. And yeah, maybe just share a little bit about the motivations for going on this trip, if it's something that you've been thinking about for a long time, or if you just heard that this trip was happening. It was maybe a cool opportunity for you to go on, and maybe also if you can share yeah, some reflections, something that you took away from the trip. So I'm going to share screens so I can share some of Jimmy's and Peter's photos, and I'm going to invite Jimmy to speak first. It's not that screen, sorry. Share with this one. Yeah. Yeah, Jimmy, would you like to go first?
All right. I'm Jimmy Chow, but Jimmy is a name that was adopted because my father said that I should have an English name. My real name is Hipman, Zhao Hapman. So they've just taken Hapman and they translate it into the English form. So my real name is Hipman Chow, all on my passport. But as a kid, I was Jimmy, James, Jim, or whatever. So on a lot of my paperwork, it's kind of fairly distorted. So from a legal point of view, I've had to go back and assume my middle name, my real name. I was um, born in China in 1948, and I lived there probably till I was two and a half, three. And what was happening was that the revolution was in full tilt. And by 48, 49, um, everyone knew that the communists were going to take over. My father came back in 47. My father is over in Canada. He actually immigrated when he was 14 years old, and he paid the $500 head tax. And he thought, oh my God, I go to Canada, I'll go back to school. And the reality of the situation was they borrowed money and did whatever they did. He came here at 14 years old and he had to go back, he had to work. And my father, after that, he actually went back to China 7 times. And I have other sisters that were born. And the last time he came back was 47. And back in Limpong Lay, um, the communists were taking over, and my sisters at the time were arranged marriages with American Chinese soldiers that were fighting there. So they were looking for wives, and I don't think my sister was that enthusiastic, but it was a way to get out of China because we were obviously not the welcoming people anymore because we were educated and because my grandfather had come to Canada and my dad, they sent money back. So we bought land and they're all hoping to come back. But with the political situation, we left. So I came to Canada with my mother. We flew from, we actually snuck out of China. My sister helped us smuggle out by a boat. My mother was packing a couple of bags and her homeopathic book that she still regretted every month, saying, "I wish I had my book with all my actual wonderful concoctions." Anyways, we're at Hong Kong and we were there for a while, and then my father arranged for us to fly to Vancouver. We're one of the first immigrants flying. I guess it would be 1950, so it would be a four-prop plane, and the only range was it would fly to Tokyo, Hawaii, Fairbanks, Alaska, and then to Vancouver. My father at the time was in the restaurant business, so he came back to Vancouver and met us, and we stayed in Vancouver for a while. And he had a restaurant business up in Manitoba called Sheridan near Churchill. So my poor mother, hopping on the train from a subtropical country, tr heading up there, all she could probably see was just snowbanks on the side. She hated it. My father took over another little restaurant in Saskatchewan, and we were there for 2 years from 4 to 6. And that's where I learned to speak English in a small town in Saskatchewan. I started school in a one-room school, and then my mother's sister was in Quebec, so we she wanted to go see them, so we were there for 4 months, and the snow and the inclement weather was just too much. For me, it was good. As a kid, I didn't go to school. I started school in Saskatchewan for 4 weeks. I went to Quebec. I didn't go to school. And I was speaking French. And then we came back to Vancouver, and we settled in downtown in a hotel, and renting suites. And I started school at Strathcona, and they thought I was brilliant because I could speak English, Chinese, and French. Well, I couldn't read and I couldn't write. They should have like kept me back, but that was the story. We then moved to Mount Pleasant. I went to high school and college and all that stuff, and then from a career point of view, I was going to be a social worker. I didn't do that, and ending up in the film industry for 45 years. But where I was always interested in going back to China, my mother was petrified. She just wouldn't go, even though her friends and her sister would go. And I had no idea how I was going to do it. I had friends who were working in Hong Kong. They worked for the Time magazine. They said, "Jimmy, just come on over." And I'm going, well, okay, but I'd worked in Hong Kong in '78 on a movie there, and I tried to get in, and I just didn't have the visa. So, but I really wanted to go. My mother was just petrified, and I just happened to be in a social situation, and Henry was at the head table, and we were talking, and he told me about what he was doing, and I went to a couple of meetings, and there it was, just before COVID. I actually had to go. My wife was interested in going, but she declined not to go. It was a wonderful experience. I went there because I'd worked in Hong Kong before, and that's when all the riots were happening. And I just wanted to see what it was really like. And when I got to Hong Kong, I didn't go to the riots. I waited till the riots had cleared by, so I would go there and see for yourself. So it's really interesting. Anything is to actually experience it. So we met these wonderful people. We all got together and we headed in, and it was a wonderful 12. I can't describe it as the most stimulating part of my life. I could actually reflect back, and the organization was fantastic. The the, the people there, they found my village, they found relatives. We organized all that, and I don't know how I would have done it because I didn't know where the village. I knew the names and all that. Didn't know where it was. Where would I stay? And it was wonderful. I met people that were actually relatives, and this one lady in this photograph to my left, it was my um, brother's wife, and she was so excited to see me. And I saw pictures that my parents had sent back with that they had posted, but it was really quite memorable. And my mother always thought, "Oh my God, we've lost all this land. You should go claim it." Well, that's the past, and what it is. But the actual experience of going there with the opera people, the calligraphy, and just going there and seeing what China really was and what it really is and where it's going, and going back and paying homage to my relatives. There were no markers, so I had just had to follow them, and they would tell me basically where it was. So what I did was I said, well, what if my kids come back? So I actually put markers on all the graves. That was one of my little contributions. So all I can say, it's a life-changing experience, and to see where your roots were just wonderful. And it's all I can say. It's just a wonderful part of my life and a great experience.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Jimmy.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd like to invite Peter to share some thoughts next. Peter, you're muted.
Of course I'm muted, of course. So as Rosalie said, my name is Peter Hum, and first I want to say that it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be taking part in this webinar, and I want to say thanks to Rosalie for asking me. I live in Ottawa, which is where I was born, and I went on the trip last fall, excuse me, to Sanonlei in Kaiping, which is my paternal ancestral village. And I also went to Beikun, which is my maternal ancestral village. And that's about 3.5, maybe 4 hours to the east of Kaiping, and it's basically been swallowed up by Guangzhou. And I guess I took this trip perfect. That is perfect timing. Thank you, Rosalie. I took this trip to address a huge gap in my family history, which is something that I had felt to, a greater or lesser degree, uh, pretty much, I guess you could say, for all my life. And what I like to say before I took this trip was that I could only trace my family back 2 generations and about 100 years to a Chinese restaurant in downtown Ottawa on Rideau Street. So this photo that's up on the screen, um, this gives you a sense of how little I and my cousins kind of knew about our ancestors. So this photo was in the possession of my cousin for many years, but he actually did not know who these people were. Um, but when I saw it, I was able to, and I only saw it last year, I was able to identify those people. So going uh, going left to right, that is my Uncle Charlie at the age of about 5. Uh, that's a man who I now think is a relative of the woman sitting to his left, who is my grandmother. That's, I think, one of only maybe 3 or 4 photos of my grandmother. That's my Aunt Jessie in the middle there, smiling. She's maybe 8 years old. That's my grandfather, who one of his names we'll just say is James Hum. That's my father holding the teddy bear, who's about 2 years old. And that's my Uncle Tom, who's about 10 in that photo. So this photo was taken in Ottawa. We think about 1924. And I took this trip to feel more connected to these people, to these grandparents that I had never met. They died decades before I was born, and to these other people who I had met, but who I only knew as adults. And they frankly didn't talk much about their childhood at all to us, just I managed to pry some information out from my father, as I'll tell you later. But I guess what I should say to set things up, and I'm mindful that I don't want to take too much time. If we could just go back to the photo, Rosalie, back to the family photo, is that the twist in my family story is that my grandmother in this photo died probably within a year or a year and a half of when this photo was taken in 1925. She died in Ottawa pretty suddenly of, it turns out now, I only learned this this year, that it was pulmonary tuberculosis that killed her. And as a result, her widow, or my grandfather took the children in that photo and himself and went back to Sanonlei in China. And you could say for more or less the family lived there for about 10 years, from 1925 to 1935, with some sort of going back and forth by various people, because life was kind of straddled between China and Canada, between Sun Lei and Ottawa. But I really knew very little about all of this. It was kind of the stuff of lore and legend, but as far as details went, they were really very, very scant. Maybe, Rosalie, if you could show the second photo. I did get my father, before he passed away in 2005, to write his memoirs, and this was like absolutely crucial. And I would say anybody who's in a position similar to that with their parents, if you ask them to tell you as much as possible about their lives and the lives of people who came before them, it can be tremendously helpful. Like really, years later, it can change your life. So I was fortunate enough that I had this information that you'll see on the first page that's written in Chinese, which is the name of my father's village. So this is where they went back to in China after my grandmother passed away. And there's even a photo of the village beneath it on the left-hand page. And then on the right-hand page, there's a photo of the school that my father attended when he was, basically a preteen. So I don't want to go on at length about all of this, because I'll be happy to answer any questions later. Plus, I wrote a really, really, really long story that ran in newspapers across Canada as a result of this trip. So if you're curious, just Google my name in China. You can read 4,500 words, more than you'll want to know about what happened to me and to them and to us, I guess you could say. But what I do want to say is that because of these 2 pages in my father's memoirs, I had a notion in an abstract way that, oh, I could possibly go back to China, but this seemed to me like, a near impossible quest, because my Chinese is basically toddler level, if that. Culturally, I'm very Western, or so I thought of myself. I just thought I would be like a complete fish out of water if I were to go to China and try to find these places in these photos that correspond to those characters on that page. But fortunately, what happened to me is I played tourist in Vancouver in August. I went to the Chinese Canadian Museum in Vancouver. I saw the paper trail exhibit, which was fantastic. I met Elwin, who said, oh, if you go to the research room, then Naomi can help you. Naomi can find out information for you. And that's what happened. It was all very kind of linear and serendipitous. And Naomi found some further information about the people in that first photo. Facts and photos from the CI documents that are now like treasured in my family. And she found, documents that had the names of my grandfather in Chinese in his own hand. So this, and then crucially, Naomi told me, oh, there's this trip you can take in November. And subsequently, I spoke to Daniel, like I think very soon afterwards. And, within a matter of days or 2, I kind of figured out, well, yes, I can do this. I can take this great leap of faith and go on this trip. And that's what I did. And as Jimmy spoke, the things that he said were really resonated with me. I have some photos that are similar to what Jimmy showed, although, I don't want to steal anyone else's time or thunder. I will say, as Jimmy said, that it was an absolute life changer for me. I've got a lot of work to do, I guess, in terms of what's the word? I've reconnected myself, I guess, to this group of distant relatives that I did not know existed. You'll see them. These are cousins of mine, you could say, and I now have an ongoing relationship with these people, and I'm looking forward to traveling back to the village and to visit these distant relatives with quite a few cousins of mine and our kids. So we're trying to figure out how we can replicate the experience I had at a greater scale for the Hum family at large. So it's really not only myself that's benefited from this trip, but now it's 25, 30 people in here in Ontario that are trying to figure out how we can do this for ourselves and benefit from it.
Thank you, Peter, for sharing that. That was really beautiful. Naomi, would you like to go next?
Yep. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can you see that? Okay, good. All right, so in November 2024, I was on the same trip as Peter and Melanie, and I had known that Henry was preparing for this trip for quite some time. But initially, I thought that I wasn't going to be able to go whatsoever because I had a big work project and a bunch of other things that I was going to be doing at the exact same time. So I wrote it off. And then that work project got delayed. And so I had actually just been contacted by Daniel, who was working on as the program assistant on the trip. And he had asked me to put out the word at CCM since there were still some more spots. And he asked me if I knew anyone who was interested in going. And I thought, actually, I'm interested in going. So I signed up. And my reasons for going, I had always been I'd grown up with the stories of my family and their journey from China, but in kind of a distant fashion. I'm fifth generation Chinese Canadian, the last person in my family to live or to at any point in time in the village was my great grandfather, and he came over to Canada when he was 16 years old. So I was interested in kind of seeing this for myself, but I also was really interested in just seeing more of the history there. I did my master's at UBC in immigration history, and I'm going to do my PhD later on that. And so I thought I wanted to know if I could do any research there. I wanted to just see a country I'd never seen before. And so initially, because I had kind of jumped into this trip at such a late date, I thought, well, it's a bit too late to go back to my ancestral village. My family's village is in the county of Zhongshan, which is a bit further out than from Kaiping, where the trip was headquartered, and it would take a bit longer to get to. I didn't have as much time as I wanted to kind of look around and prepare documents to figure out how to visit the village. And so initially I said no. And part of me also had reservations because my family was so distant. I didn't know if there would be anyone there in the village to meet me. I knew that we had very distant kind of cousins in the village still, but not that many. But after thinking about it a bit, I thought, it's kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. And so I decided to go. And because I had been doing all this research at the Chinese Canadian Museum, genealogical research, I had actually a lot of documents like Canadian CI, Chinese immigration documents on my own family that I'd also pulled up over the years out of my own interest. And my family has been very good at compiling genealogical research materials, thanks to my Uncle Andrew and Auntie Deb and a couple other people who really had kind of put together a family tree, the name and location of our village, which is Dutao. And so I had that to go off of as well. And so even though I had been concerned it would just be too much work and I wouldn't be able to provide the researchers on Celia Tan, the Chinese side's kind of team, with enough documents to figure it out and put it all together in just a short amount of time. We actually had quite a lot. And so they were able to put this together, even though I decided very late in the game. And so we went on kind of the second day of the trip after we had landed. I knew that Dutao was going to be a lot more urbanized than a lot of the other villages because Zhongshan is part of the special economic zone that kind of got to be capitalist before everybody else in China. And so it's really become a hub of manufacturing. Some of my aunts and uncles had been back, but not for kind of a couple decades at that point in time when it was still much more um, like less urbanized. And so I was expecting it to be pretty urbanized, but when I got there, it was kind of shocking because it's basically just a suburb of this massive, massive metropolis. The picture here is me at the village gate. You can kind of see that the gate is pretty new. It was built in the 1980s. It's basically kind of like an average, it looks honestly like an average kind of suburb, but there's traces of the old village. So, oops. So I went to see the Ancestral Hall. This is the kind of altar in the Ancestral Memorial Hall that serves as a shrine to the ancestors of the village. And here on the left, they had this mural which depicts the Chinese villagers fighting off the British during the Opium Wars in the 1840s because apparently the village used to be on the water, and so it was part of the land that was actually taken by the British during the Opium Wars. And so I had always kind of suspected that just from what my family had told me that our village was part of the land that was directly taken by the British. And so this actually confirmed that for me. And so that was really cool to see. I spent a lot of time walking around the village. They had this kind of nice park. This is one of the newer streets. You can see that a lot of these buildings, they look like they were built in the 1980s, I think. And so they like kind of sprung up as part of this massive like push to urbanize China and modernize China in the 80s. But here's the kind of the contrast on the left. We have portions of the old village, and then on the right, just the huge skyscrapers in the background. I had hoped to see our family's ancestral home since I know that our ancestral home is still standing. But because I had jumped onto the trip just late into the game, I wasn't able to figure that out in time. But I did get to see something really cool, which was the ancestral genealogical book. Every family in the village still has this kind of like ancestral book, which has a list of all the families and the family trees that are descended from the village. And so I wasn't expecting to find anything because my family has kind of been away from the village for so long. But one of the village elders invited me into their home and showed me this book. And that you could see that I'm pointing to a name there. That's my dad's name in Chinese. Because our family members have actually sent our names or the names back to the village elders over the years, and so they've been incorporating it into that. And that for me was kind of a shocking moment because I had always thought of us as being cut off and as from the village, but in some ways that was a projection of kind of the way that I had been brought up in North America. That's not necessarily the way that they see it in the village. And so that was a really cool moment for me. I think I'm the 28th generation of Louis from Dutao Village, and it was, even though this book was compiled in 2002, so not way too, no time to add our generation in, it seems like they all continue to add names throughout the years. And so I thanked the village elders, and they said, well, thank you for coming back to kind of see this through a translator, because it's important that we're glad to kind of see that people in Canada and North America still care about this. And so seeing the kind of reciprocal relationship that there was really cool. And this is just a picture of the main street in the village. You can see it's extremely modern. And I did all this with the help of our 2 translators from Celia Tan's team, Monica and Eileen, who were so, so helpful, because I was really concerned kind of about going back. I don't speak a word of Chinese, and I didn't know how I was possibly going to ever do that without the help of translation. But they were super, super helpful with all of this. And then the other cool thing is that I got to kind of see the village pretty well, and the translators and Celia's team were also very, very helpful with getting us to adapt to some of the stuff like WeChat. It's a totally different technological landscape over there. You have to have a phone, you have to do everything with WeChat and Alipay and all that. And so that was really, really helpful for them to basically save me from some WeChat disasters and payment disasters when I was there. And that also gave me the confidence to know that if I wanted to go back or help someone else go back, that I would be able to do that. And it turned out it was perfect timing, because my auntie Maxine, who's here in the pink shirt there, is actually there right now. She's visiting some of her cousins that she hasn't seen since the last time she went back in the 80s. And so she's been sending me WeChat pictures and WhatsApp pictures every day. And I was able to give her a brief WeChat introduction when I saw her in November. And so that's been really great. And then for the rest of the trip, I had such a good time just with our fellow kind of people on the trip. We had a lot of fun doing the workshops and stuff. I got as much out of that as I got out of the village visit. So yeah, just a great trip in general.
Thanks for sharing, Naomi. That sounds like, I mean, I really want to go on one of these trips in the future as well, but this, yeah, your experience just sounded so positive, and that was really great. Melanie, would you like to share some of your experiences?
Sure. Can everyone, is my screen up now?
Yes, but you may want a full screen.
Okay. What about how's that? Like, I know it's you've got my sidebars, but can people see the photo on the screen by any chance?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. This photo is of my great grandmother and my Gong, who is the adorable child on the right, and his older brother, who's on the left. And I'm sure I'll get into a lot more of the story later on in the webinar, because I know we have lots more questions, but I thought it'd be nice to have their photo up, because in many ways, this photo is what centers my experience with the trip and my introduction to Chinese Canadian migration in general. So I'll just leave that there for now as a bit of an inspirational anchor. But to introduce myself, my name is Melanie. Like Peter, I'm from Ontario, but from Toronto, not Ottawa. And I also went on the trip in November of 2024. I went to 2 villages, Cheung Fat and Joidu, which are both in the Toisan region of the Pearl River Delta. And I heard about this trip through a lot of academic and community circles that I find myself kind of moving within. And at first, I think much like Naomi, I thought, oh, there's no way I can go on this trip. I'm a grad student, so my schedule is pretty packed, and I don't have a lot of time, and I have even less money to go all the way to China. And my Chinese language skills are very, very, very bad and poor. And so I kind of reached out to the UBC team, kind of like Hail Marying, being like, I know this trip is happening. I'd love to go on it. Are there any research assistantship opportunities? And they said, no, unfortunately not at first, but it seems like luckily, because of some different structures with the program that seem to be changing that Henry got into earlier, I think 3 weeks out of the trip beginning, I got an email saying, are you still interested? If so, let's talk. And so with 3 weeks before the trip launched, I got my visa, I bought a plane ticket, and I booked a hotel in Hong Kong, and I got to go on this trip, which was something which has been kind of like a dream of mine for many, many years. Like I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto, and I study Chinese migration to and through Canada, looking at paper sons, paper daughters, paper wives, paper families. And so in many ways, I feel like I've been preparing to go on a trip like this for almost my entire life for research purposes, just as much as like personal family interest. And so I've always had and done a lot of reading about the North American side of Chinese Canadian history and family stories. And because of that, I've gotten a lot of North American perspectives, like Chinese North American perspectives, but North American perspectives nonetheless. And so I really wanted to know what these stories would look like told from the other direction, looking from Toisan out to Gold Mountain. And because I've never been to China, I had no idea what to expect. I was born in Canada. My parents were born in Hong Kong, but both immigrated to Toronto quite early on in their lives and grew up in Toronto. Though my grandparents and my family ancestry is from Toisan and Hoi Ping. And so, despite having these connections, I didn't really know a lot about them. And I think one of the really interesting things about my family situation, which I'm learning increasingly as I do more oral histories and talking with other people on the trip, is that even though my great-grandfathers traveled from China to Canada in the early 1900s, and they went all over the country, and they from Canada also went to places in the US, Cuba, Peru, and lived in Vancouver and lived in Victoria and registered for the national Chinese registration during the Exclusion Act in Canada. And so we have this big, long history of being Chinese Canadian, but I'm actually the first full generation of my family born here in Canada, like 100 years after the first Ing and the first Li set foot in the country that we now call home. And so I always thought that was a very interesting and kind of traumatic past I wanted to learn about. And I'm very fortunate that my gongong and my pawpaw told me all these stories about their early lives in the village, and just living around the Toronto Chinatown community, hearing other people's stories that they share with me in my capacity as like just a community member, but also a researcher. I've had this great mental picture of what Toisan looks like and what the experiences were building in my head. But it's been so great to actually go and connect with this mental picture and fill in different missing puzzle pieces. And I think I'll leave that there because I went on for a bit longer than I intended to, but there's so many other questions that I'm sure we'll get to later. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Melanie. Thank you all for sharing. I'm going to move us into gallery view so you can see everyone's faces. So we have about 30 minutes of discussion time. So I have a few broad questions for the panelists to kind of elaborate on some of the responses that you had in introducing yourselves and your experiences. And I know there have been a lot of different topics that were touched on individually and a lot of common threads as well. So and I know everyone, yeah, has very different experiences and backgrounds. So I'm going to ask a few questions that anyone can respond to. So feel free to chime in at any point. But I'm curious, for those of you who had been thinking about going on this trip, what kind of preparation you did. So I know some of you, I mean, Naomi, you have been working doing genealogical research for others and also for yourself, and you touched on that a little bit. But for everyone else, like what were some of the expectations that you had, and how did that change afterwards? Is that Jimmy wanting to raise your hand?
Rosalie, I've lost audio. I can't hear you.
Oh, is everyone else able to hear me okay? It may be on your end, Jimmy. Are you able to hear me now? No? Um, I'm going to message you privately, but if anyone would like to hop in and take a stab at elaborating on any of those questions, preparations and expectations, yeah.
Why don't I quickly weigh in, actually, just to come in quickly about what would be ideal moving forward for a lot of those people listening and who are maybe thinking about joining trips. I think Melanie and Naomi both kind of elaborated a little bit about how actually it's best to have as much done already. I think both Peter and Jimmy, by the time they came, they had tried to exhaust as much information as they could in terms of what they could know from Ottawa or from Vancouver. And I think that's really the best way, because it's expensive to go. It's all we were really lucky and fortunate to be able to bring both Melanie and Naomi because one of the things we've tried to do in the trips before, like we've gone 2019, 2015 with adults, is that to be able to also have, people who are at a more established point in their life. I'm going to use a euphemism. Be able to help younger people who maybe are less established and less financially able to do it. And so, when Melanie kind of contacted us and say, "Is there any way for us to go?" What we were doing in those weeks between was scrambling and kind of saying, "Is there a way we can do this where, because we've the overhead costs, so to speak, of going," and that includes a lot of that staff support. Multiple people mentioned Daniel Chen, who was basically the logistics person who organized all kinds of things starting over a year before we went in November. And and again, shout out to Daniel for actually being creative and sort of really wanting to find a way to help uh, uh, students. Naomi recently graduated from her master's before she went to Chinese Canadian Museum to become one of the researchers, and now is going off to do her PhD at NYU. And so congratulations to Naomi. And Melanie is doing her PhD in University of Toronto. We thought it was so important that young people have that experience. And again, going back to what I said about younger people being able to experience this and perhaps having a different experience, but still just being able to go and what it might mean to both of them as they move on as in their lives as researchers. So that's why we thought it was so important. It's great to have a lot of people, go who are searching for roots. Um, and I loved the way Peter and Jimmy both sort of really thought about specific people in their families that they wanted to know more about, that relatives and fleshing out a sense of who you are through understanding where you've come from, in terms of genealogy, in terms of the village you've come from. This past is shaped, we're all shaped by our past. We're shaped by our families. We're shaped by the people who've come before us. We know this. That's why we have Qingming. That's why we pay respect to ancestors who came generations before who we've never met. But there's something about this trip and finding more about that actual place and being there, retracing the footsteps of your ancestors as they left those villages, and you're going in reverse back to these villages that they left. There's something, even if you never get to meet them, they're passed away, or they're only a photo, right? Or they're generations ago and have long passed from this earth. I think that's something that I heard in all four unite. But going back to that point of how well prepared should you be before going on a trip like this, as as prepared as you can. That makes it a much more meaningful. In fact, one of the things about the way we actually even do it on the ground is this November, we weren't able to for various reasons develop, but in previous trips, we always waited until the end of, Jimmy will remember, we waited until the end of the time there to then do the village trips so that we can give as much orientation and prep to the visitors about what life is like, what historically things were like. And so, yeah, prep is huge. If you just show up there and you have no, then it's just bewildering. It's you're not able to actually have a transformative experience, just to use that term that some people have already used. The preparation is really key. So just as a kind of from a trip organizing perspective, being ready to go is important.
If I could jump in, one of the things that Henry said to me before, and said to all of us really before we went, was to keep our minds open and to not even have expectations or kind of a script or just an idea of how exactly we wanted it to go, because that kind of would raise the stakes to the point where if it didn't go how we were imagining it to go, it could end up being an emotionally or just difficult experience for us. And that really helped me. And also, I think made it so that I got way more out of it, because it made me able to appreciate things that were way beyond just what I saw in the village, and to appreciate other parts of the village. And I think also I had done kind of some of the prep work on the Canadian side with the genealogical documents, and that really, really helped me so much, especially things that I had gotten from other family members, because it meant that when the time came, even though I was scrambling and super rushed, I basically was able to hand over all the documents to Celia's team and say, this is my village, and they could immediately pinpoint it on the map.
Yeah, I would say for my part that I was lucky to have very clean information from my father. So it wasn't like a big goose chase. And then Naomi was able to find further corroborative information that just put more flesh on those bones. And then I think beyond that, I think at Daniel's suggestion, I went and got like pictures of my father's tombstones and things from like my extended family again, all to just prove something true, like a third time or a fourth time. And then what that meant with respect to the Chinese research team was that they were able to hit the ground, go into the village, find the documents that were there with respect to genealogy, and well, I mean, if I can talk about expectations, I did have several, um, and one was to set foot in the village and be there. And the second one that I had was to pay respects to my grandparents. If we look very quickly at those photos, I'd just make a few remarks. If you can help me out there, Rosalie.
Sorry, give me one moment to
Yeah,
pull it
sorry to
back
spring
up.
this on you, but
Okay.
I guess one lesson for me of going on this trip was it smacked me in the face just how humble the village was. I had known that it was spoken of as a village of 100 people, all named Hum, but when I got there, um, I went to a village that, in stark contrast to other villages that we'd seen, or in contrast to Naomi's village, there is no village gate. There's just like a corrugated steel sign by the side of the road. And then um, if we are able to flick through some of the photos there of the village, then it's pretty ramshackle. That's all you see to see that you are at Sunonlay from the characters. And then if we can go through a bit more, you'll see this is a village in its last legs, right? Um, and so that is my ancestral home there on the right. That's my very happy cousin. That's one of my guides on the right there. Her name is Chloe. She was fantastic. We're still in touch. I think if we can just flick through a bit more, please. I think you'll see. So there, similarly to Jimmy, I was able to pay my respects to my grandfather and grandfather who were in that very first photo. And then I guess, you know, the icing on the cake, or really like the thing that is now an ongoing thing in my life, is that because of the researchers in China, they were able to fulfill my 2 expectations, but there was a third surprise waiting for me in the village. I think it was only a few days before we got on the train in Hong Kong. It might have been the night before even. I was in Hong Kong, but I got the village report sent to me and it said, "Oh, you have these relatives to meet," which just, you know, sent my head completely spinning. And so in addition to kind of the lesson of humility and sacrifice and hardship that, you know, was the nature of my ancestors' lives, my grandparents' lives. It's what they fled, you could say. I met these people who are connected to that more immediately, who know in some ways my ancestors better than I did, because some of them were contemporaneous, and uh, I'm I'm still in touch with a woman named Vera, who I guess is my niece. She's in the leftmost photo in the left, and she speaks and reads English fantastically, and so we're in touch by WeChat. And so that kind of severed or truncated kind of relationship that I had to my roots in China has kind of been knit back to some degree, or we are trying to tie it back together between this Hum clan in Ontario and these people in China who, well, they're Tans, but we're all Tans or Hums, as you know, and I guess, you know, we've reconnected. It's kind of as simple as that. We'll go on trying to further that connection. It's really fantastic.
And thanks, Peter, for sharing. I just want to jump in so people can know. So one of the things that really why we ask and why Daniel asked Peter and us is to go take a photo of a headstone of a relative that you know. Is that there's 2 things that just for all you who are interested in this, interested in doing genealogical research, because of the villages in these 8 counties, they had wildly variant, what we call topolex rather than dialects. Like the way you speak is really unique to that area, like literally of the villages or the county dialect. But even within a county, there can be different. And so, in this, the same Chinese character that is the name for tan is also pronounced hum, hom, you know, tom. And so these are all actually the same clan. They have the same Chinese character name. And so one of the difficult things is when we have records that are in English on the Canada side, so the head tax registry, you'll have all these names. And for a lot of people, they don't realize that a hum is also a hom, is also a tom, is also a tam, is also a tan, is also a. They're just from slightly different areas of the 4 counties region. And then it'll be pronounced tan only in another area. So that's how sort of microscopic these variations in the dialects or the topolex. They've changed over time, which is why we call them dialects. So one of the things that is crucial is that we actually find for our China side researchers what the actual Chinese character is. And because lots of headstones in North America, you'll realize that a grandfather or a grandmother, when you go, there's actually Chinese characters there too. And it'll say things like the county and the village name from which you're from. So the village name, often the best way to find out someone who's passed away and you didn't know and you don't speak Chinese or don't read Chinese, but on the headstone, generally, if there's Chinese written there, will be the county name and the village name. And that is the first set of clues that allow our China side researchers to start to really get into those genealogical records. They can find the village. There's many villages that have the same sounding name, actually, strangely enough, because there's thousands of villages, and some of these are like very common. The Wongs in Vancouver and in most of Canada a lot of them come from Baksa, the white sand. It's because that's where it's on the side of the stream there where the village is. That got the name from that. So it's one of these things that actually doesn't translate as that, but one of the things I think I would say is that the preparation includes finding as much as possible, and then we'll work with you beforehand to say, also do this, also look at that, because some of those things like the Chinese characters, that comes from that sort of long history of people leaving, and the mono clans. Like these are they have the same clan name in these villages because the males stay and the women, the daughters of the village, marry over to other villages that are not the same clan. So there's a long history of people living very close together, these clans, and trading wives, to use that kind of way to understand it. And so people are related even so if you're a Ma, you could be very related over generations with people who are Fongs and Lees and who are in neighboring villages that you constantly are swapping, daughters with. And so that's why it's so networked. That's why family networks that have been truncated and cut off, it's resuscitating. And I think that's wonderful, Peter, and many of it's this sense of, oh, I'm actually more connected than I realized, is because those networks were so well defined for hundreds of years that you can feel isolated from them. But once you kind of get back into that, then you're finding roots. And so I'd say that's something that I think all uh, four people on the panel have kind of shared is even if you feel isolated from it, there are these networks, these roots, that you're actually a part of.
If I can jump in kind of on the end of Henry, what you're just saying about the networks and the closeness. I have a photo that I'd like to, actually I have two photos that I'd like to share. The first one, not that one, not that one. This one. So this photo here is a photo from the farmlands of one of the villages I went to in Toisan, and somebody in the chat asked what my ancestral villages were there. And this one is from the village of I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, I'm really sorry, but it's Jeoju. But if you look at the buildings in this village, they're very close together. And I think, one, you can say it's just not a lot of land, like it's just, it's easier to build smaller buildings, but to me, looking at it as well, it really illustrates why, or in part why, family and kin was so important, why village kin was so important when they were sending sons and daughters overseas. They live so close together in the homeland. Everybody knows each other's business. When you live so close together, you need each other to help survive, to help support your family at home and abroad. And I think a really kind of humorous illustration of that in present day is, when I got to this village, I had no idea what to expect from the people because I had no connections there. I didn't even know if there would be anyone to greet me. But I get there, or actually, sorry, the night before I fly to Hong Kong, I get a call from my dad's sister, my aunt, and it's 11 p.m. and I'm barely awake. And she was like, do you know so-and-so in this village? And I was like, no, because I hadn't even received my village report yet. And she goes, well, they contacted our relative in Regina who called me and said so-and-so's daughter of so-and-so's father is coming. They know you're coming. The entire village knows you're coming. And so, we live in Toronto. I guess she's my great aunt / third cousin or something, lives in Regina, who got this message from this woman who's not even from my father's village, or sorry, my grandfather's village, but from the village right beside it, who all have this network still alive, who knew I was coming. And so, to circle back to, Henry's comment about the closeness and the support and why we still have these connections, I think, this picture and my experience is just such a great illustration of that. And then to go into a bit of a different direction in terms of expectation, I really wanted to show this photo here, because again, I had zero expectations for this trip. I guess the only expectation I had was the stories that Gongong told me. And he told me he grew up in a rural village in Toisan. He's from Chengfat. And he said there was farm, his house was made of earth, and they were very poor. And so I get there and I was like, well, some of these village houses, they're not mud huts. There's tile and there's steel and, concrete. And so I had expected, I think, my grandfather's memory of his village from 80 years ago. And so when I got to the village last year, those expectations were like, they definitely didn't meet reality. But what I think is so interesting is that even though the villages themselves have changed, there was so much that I experienced there that was actually very similar to what I was familiar with in my community in Toronto. So in the middle of this photo is choy gon, which is dried choy. And in Toisan, it's very common for villagers to take choy and dry it on bamboo racks in the sun. And then, you use it for herbal medicines and soups. And this is something I'm familiar with and I grew up with in Canada. And so I wanted to center that in the photo because this connection, this practice is still so close. And so on the right side of the picture is the older village houses that, despite not being made of earth, is maybe more what my Gongong remembers. But on the left side, you see the city of Toisan coming out in the horizon. And I even hesitate to call it horizon because it is right there. It is across the village communal pond. And so I had grown up thinking that this village was in the middle of just rice paddies and farmland and potatoes. But the reality is in China, like in Canada, neighborhoods change and there's urban sprawl. And so what I hadn't expected was this whole landscape to be different. But I think that was kind of the beauty of going in with like maybe a little bit of expectations, but not a lot, and being able to appreciate not just my ancestors past, but also how, people still live here. And so while the present marches on, we still keep these traditional practices at the same time, and they don't have to be separate.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Melanie. I wanted to show really quick a photo from Peter of his family's tombstones for anyone who is interested in actually being able to find their village names that are on there. Peter, did you want to speak to these photos yourself? You're muted right now.
Just to say that this is Daniel had asked for this photo, I believe, and so I sent it along, and then, subsequently I ran it through Google Translate, and you can see, I guess, well, I have to turn my head sideways to read it, but, further, yes, exactly, further evidence that, we were on the right track, I guess. But this is out there, I guess, for everyone who's got similar tombstones in their family history, or it can be the case.
And thanks for pointing out that Google trick. So for a lot of you out there, Peter's run it through Google Translate into Chinese, and you can see that's actually Pinyin, so it's Mandarin. But Google, strangely enough, being Google, on the web-based Google Translate, you can also translate into Cantonese, which although will not be exact to the village dialects, if you're from Toisan, for instance, or Koiping, it could be, it's still at least Cantonese. So right now, though, that's showing Pinyin because if you do have a chance to do this after this workshop, go out and take a photo at the cemetery. You're going to be there for Qingming probably, hopefully anyway. So take a photo and run it through your web browser, Google Translate, and go find Cantonese, and it will give you an approximation. Standard Cantonese is going to be also different than, say, your village dialect, but it on the whole is much closer than Northern Chinese. As my grandfather used, my father's from the north, which meant for my grandfather, who was from Zhongshan, anywhere north of Zhongshan was Northerners. They were all kind of Northern barbarians who spoke this weird language that was unintelligible, Mandarin. The same thing that Mandarins, the scholar officials spoke, and that's why it's called Mandarin, is that the Portuguese noticed that people who they met, who were merchants and migrants in Southeast Asia, they spoke a certain way, and then the scholar officials all spoke a different way, and the Portuguese word for sort of these officials was Mandarins, and that's why this language is very standard for most of China, except for really southern China, Guangdong, and then Fujian. They'll speak a different, again, southern Chinese form. Often called Hokkien or Min language. So these are the kinds of things, the language itself, but because the characters often are at least there, we can find the original um, village much easier. We can also track and trace the exact name versus a kind of English transliteration of a village dialect's pronunciation of someone's Chinese name, because generally speaking, the name that's on there will be the actual characters of the person's name as given or as adopted if they change their name later as an adult. So just for those genealogy detectives out there who are trying to follow up on your own, this is the kind of stuff that you hopefully can do before setting off on a trip.
Yes, and there's a lot of questions in the Q&A about kind of practical tips that I wanted to be able to have someone speak to as well. So I also want to point out that we do have a lot of really great resources through past virtual workshops that we've done. For the Finding Your Family's Paper Trail series, I'll link it in the chat later for anyone who's interested in being able to know how to search government documents to find those family records. June Chow, Linda Yip, and Catherine Clement have created really great resources and guides for how to do that. So I highly recommend checking those out. And again, I'll share that in a moment. One of the other questions is just about the trip in general. Are there future trips that are planned? How does one find information about future trips? Henry, maybe?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, one of the things that really was this last November, we were trying to figure out, can we do this in a sustainable way? And I think I had long conversations with Peter about this afterwards too. It's like, we obviously we think the experience is amazing, but it takes a lot of work, and you can just hear about for the person who's thinking of going. And so we've asked Winnie Kwan, who was also on the trip. So Winnie's one of, again, my former students who worked at the Chinese Canadian Museum, in fact, helped set up its visitor services, oversaw its volunteers. And right now, Winnie is on a well-earned year-long sabbatical. She wanted to go to Taiwan and delayed it so that she could start working at the Chinese Canadian Museum and help get it set up. And so now that the Chinese Canadian Museum's systems are really well set up, Winnie has agreed and helped to help us actually create a more sustainable way to do this. And one of the things that we're looking out for now is actually the following November 2026, not the one coming up, to really be able to do this in our new figured out way. And we'll be partnering with the Chinese Canadian Museum. They may not know it yet because we haven't formally glued this together. But I think one of the reasons why we're doing this panel is to kind of think forward to being able to do this every year, every November. And why November, you might ask, is because you really don't want to be in southern China at most other times of the year if you're coming and doing these kind of visits and driving around and visiting rural areas, because it's a temperate, mild time in terms of its climate. It's not the monsoon season. It's not the hot, humid 40. I take students generally in June because that's when students go for summer break, and we can do a summer class, but it's like 40 degrees and a 98% humidity. And so students can handle it, although some whine and complain. But we know for people who are not used to it, in their, who are, again, more established in their life trajectory, it can be very challenging. And so November is the time. If you're thinking about this, mark in your calendars, like a 2-week, 3-week block off November 2026. And what we'll do is we'll actually start to set up some things like we think you should be starting to prep a year before in terms of really starting to, talk to relatives that you can get as much information out of older relatives who you can talk to, whether they're in Canada, United States, North America, or even anyone that you have contact with, just to start to get as much information base as you can. And so put that into a kind of mental calendar of 2026 November, and then work kind of backwards to really this fall at the latest, beginning to gather information. If you've already done a lot, great. That will be good. But starting probably about this November, we're going to start to take in requests. And so again, we're hopeful that we'll be able to do this through the Chinese Canadian Museum in terms of contacting people and through the membership list, and anyone here who's on this panel list, sort of like letting the CCM folks know, and then we'll start to put this together. So we're excited. Again, much thanks to Winnie Kwan, because she's one of the reasons why I love Winnie as a former student, and as when she was a student too, is that she's just very organized, and she's thinking, okay, there's a better way to do this, there's a better way to do that, and she's going to come up with a way in which we can do this sustainably. But one of the first things that really came up was being able to, before we hand information over to the Chinese side researchers, and this is where we put a lot of pressure on our colleague Celia Tan and all the young translators and the researchers who are behind the translators too, who create the reports, giving them as much good information and then allowing them time, because they actually are driving often to the villages and doing some early scouting and talking. So for one of the folks who isn't here, but for the November trip, the researchers had to make 2 trips to the village. Each was about a 3-hour drive out into the. It was not on the edges of the suburb like Naomi's or Melanie's villages. It was like Peter's village. It was remote and not developed yet, and so they really had to go do some pre-scouting interviewing. And that's also why the kind of last second surprises of, hey, by the way, there's relatives you're going to be able to meet, is because those were dug up with one of these pre-scouting. And I'll also give a kind of one of the folks who was in November had tried through something that's gotten My China roots in its name, had tried to do this through them. And look, I'm a university scholar, and we work with university scholars who are researchers on the other side. And Celia Tan, I can't score how crucial it is that it's her and her researchers that are doing this. She has been personally to over 3,000 villages in the Sze Yup, Sam Yup area as part of her researching for the UNESCO World Heritage Site designation, over these 25 years in her life, when she's become the best researcher. So having access to that is why it's different than, say, a commercial venture. I'm a university professor. We do this because we believe in it, because we think it's good for our students to do it. We think that why, again, Melanie and Naomi, it was so important for us to be able to do this with younger generations as well along on the trip, is we want to pass it forward, pay it forward, so to speak. My own transformative experience is something that I want others to be able to have. But it also does mean that we're doing it in a different way than say some of the commercial genealogy approaches. We're doing this as starting from the kinds of deep research that we do as scholars. And again, Melanie mentioned that she's working on Paper Sons and some of the fictive and kin and the ways that people evaded exclusionary legislation and laws and racism. And so these are the reasons we do it. It's a kind of thing that we think that can be done piggybacked on our research. And as I said, a lot of credit goes to Winnie and to Celia for also taking time off of her very busy life as a researcher to be able to help host these. And so we're looking forward to November of 2026 is hopefully a time we can really have a larger, if there's a lot of interest, larger expedition tour go. Hopefully that answers it, Rosalie. And if you didn't realize that you're going to be on the hook for as part of public programs that Chinese Community Museum is going to do, then yeah, put that into the calendar too.
No. Yeah, that's for anyone that's interested in taking part in this trip, we will, of course, do our part to be helping to promote things as well. So if you sign up for the Chinese Canadian Museum newsletter, I'll just send our website, which I'm sure many of you probably found this panel through it, so you're likely already on that listserv. But any information about future trips, once dates have been solidified, will definitely be posted through here. So keep an eye out for that. I know I am aware that it's 7:35 PST right now, which is the scheduled end of the webinar. But if people are able to stay on for like 10-15 more minutes, it would be nice to be able to get to some of the other questions that are here. So there's a few logistical questions. I see Naomi, you're typing some answers to those. But just about like if concerns that some people are having about visiting their villages without having any personal connections there. So there's someone who asked, are people who go back usually welcomed, especially if their families have given the village money over the years, and vice versa? What is the experience of anyone who their families did not give monies back to the village? Are they given an equal welcome? Does anyone want to speak to that?
So I'm sure they'll all have individual experiences. Just as a quick general one, the default is that they're going to welcome you back, because there are multiple sayings in English. There's one that leaves falling from a tree don't fall close to the roots. They're supposed to, and that's the system that was in place for hundreds of years. People go out and they're always welcome back. It's like the prodigal son. You've been wandering, and then you are always welcome back. And that is the default. If there has Because of what happened post 1949, there have been a lot of fractures, but that has not ended. The idea that the people went out and to benefit the village, because they did send money home, and people, built schools, built hospitals, built the infrastructure of the villages, the diulao that are the UNESCO World Heritage Site, these fortress mansions. These were built by overseas Chinese, and that's what we'll be seeing on the trip before you even go to your own village, is to understand that system as to why it is that you'll be welcome back. But there may be some specific circumstances in your own family where two siblings fell out because of sometimes a misunderstanding, or something and those are the kinds of things that can create issues. But I would say that in all the years I've taken people back, and sometimes people have thought, oh, they're not going to welcome me. They're not going to. And one of the shocking things is when they are welcomed, and it's just kind of no matter what, they're going to welcome you. And you don't yes, there may have been a falling out or something between two relatives, but the village will always welcome you back because you are a descendant of that village. So even if there's something between two relatives, or you didn't send money and you were supposed to, the village itself will always welcome you back because you are a descendant of that village. And so, just so you'll know, that's been one of our experiences of on our trips too, is this kind of shock. I thought there would be problems. I thought we lost our relationship. I thought I had pissed off, or my father had pissed off, or my grandmother had, broken relations. But it's like soap operas and a family drama. That may have happened to your little branch, but as Melanie showed in the village is hundreds, and they're all related. And so in the end, you're still family, and that is something that I would say, there are going to be individual experiences. And so Naomi, I know, and others will have some specific instances, but just as a general rule, the village will always welcome you back.
Yeah, I saw you raise your hand, Naomi. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that in my personal experience, I see people are putting questions in the chat about did your family, how much money did your family give and did that affect things? In my personal experience, extended members of our family have contributed and donated to the school and the ancestral hall and that kind of thing. But when I was there, nobody was asking me about money. No one asked me, oh, what's the numerical sum of the money that your family has invested in your village? I think coming from kind of this North American perspective, we often think about things as more transactional in terms of money than the perspective over there is. I think if I had ever, I only met kind of with one village elder, but they never even asked me like, what is your family's like have are they even donating money back to your relatives here or not? And I think it's important for all of us to realize that the way that we think about money and the way that they think about money is not necessarily the same, that sometimes we're presuming this kind of transactionality to these kinds of ancestral ties that just does not really exist.
Yeah, echoing or agreeing with everything Naomi and Henry says, like it's unexpectedly welcoming. One thing I would say, and the team, the trip team helps you with this, is that when you or if you decide to visit your village, I would say being respectful of village practices and ceremonies will take you a very long way. And so we were prepped to, show up with some lycée, but also when you're visiting your village house, your ancestral home, or if the researchers were able to find ancestral plots, making sure you bring things that, when you go visit the cemetery in Canada or wherever you live, you would bring oranges, you would bring, different, I don't want to say snacks, but, like the chicken, the pork. And so we were all prepped in the pre lead up to the trip to do so. My parents ended up tagging along with me. And so we had the stuff, the barbecue meat, fruits and everything. And in the first village, we had it all there with the incense and the candles and the firecrackers. But there were so many villagers in my first village that they ate most of the offerings. And so by the time we got to the second village, we had the lycée still, we had the incense, but we were out of barbecue meat. And there was a village elder who went up to my father, thank goodness, not me, but was like, you came empty-handed. And so, they were still welcoming and friendly, but it people do take note. So that would be my tidbit of advice for anyone planning a trip.
That's why thanks, Melly, for giving that very personal story, because you're welcome, but one of the great things is that if we have that week beforehand, and in November we actually, for all kinds of reasons I mentioned, we ended up going to the villages right away, and things can fall through the cracks then, because after a week, then it's like, okay, you're more than prepared to know what an overseas Chinese coming back to their ancestral villages is supposed to do, and there's a long time of prepping. And so Jimmy's year, I think by the time everybody in Jimmy's group went sprinkling in their different directions, everyone was a bit more prepped with what to have in hand. But because that's also about the relationality that I think Naomi mentioned, this kind of, these are relationships, even though you don't realize you're still in a relationship because of these family networks. You are still, I don't know if when you were young, having to learn what to call your relatives, we'd always spend like, we met a new relative, you would spend 10 minutes figuring out what you're supposed to call so and so, because every single relationship has an exact name. You are the third brother's wife's second son, and that's how you should address each other. That's how family is in these villages. Now, China itself has changed, and so people who grew up in the city in China who are going back to villages, they will come empty-handed and do these awful, shocking things from the village perspective too. So that's part of the changes in China, is that as it urbanized, these villages have become hollowed out in the middle. there are often lots of elders and grandkids that they're helping take care of because it's too expensive for these grandkids to be in the cities where parents are. But that's one of the interesting things, again, that hopefully if you do have a chance to go, you'll see that China has changed, as Melanie said. And that's one of the things to be open to, is that your village may have become a suburb, or your village may actually be very similar to the way it was 100 years ago in I think Peter's village's case. So lots of different ways that experiences will vary.
On this topic, I guess, of gratitude and connections between the village and Canada, I mean, I'll just offer up a few tidbits from my own experience, which is I had a sense that even though I was the first Hum to visit the village in 40 plus years, um, that I was welcomed, not because I gave money, but because in 1970 my aunt sent $20 to them in an envelope, and they still had these envelopes with the letters in them. And going back a further generation, the grandmother who had passed away in Canada in 1925, before she did that, from the money that was earned at this Chinese restaurant in Ottawa, she sent enough money back to the village to build one of the floors of the watchtower. So that's her legacy, and I kind of felt that I was standing on the shoulders of that legacy when I visited. So, I I have kind of goosebumps talking about it, to be honest. It's really quite special.
One last question I think that's in here is just about, again, further resources. Where does one go if they would like to learn more about their family villages or be able to locate them? And I think Naomi is a really good person to answer that question.
Resources. So first of all, having the experience of people who have actually lived in China for a bit or have been back a few times was super, super helpful. We got some of that from the trip organizers, mostly Daniel and Winnie, who did translation and were so, so helpful with all of this, and especially for the kind of cultural differences that Melanie mentioned. I think they did a good job of explaining to us what the culture was and what would be expected of us. And that also made me feel much more comfortable that I wasn't going to walk in and do something that would be accidentally really offensive. They were also super, super helpful with getting us in touch with kind of the technological aspect of it. There's such a huge technological learning curve of everything in China now. Everything is handled through apps and a phone. It's all stuff that's really different from what we have over here, because most of what we have is like just blocked in China. And so talking to people like that was really, really helpful. I spent quite a bit of time, although not as much as I wanted to, doing a lot of Googling around. There are a lot of really good guides on the web on how to get set up with WeChat, Alipay, that kind of thing. That was super, super helpful. In terms of other resources, as I kind of mentioned in the chat, I do genealogical research help for anyone who's interested in the CI documents. Those were super, super helpful to provide to Celia's team. And I'm at CCM on Thursdays at 10:30 to 1:30. So drop in or send me an email. I put my email in the chat. Another thing that it was super, super helpful was just having the knowledge of stuff in Chinese. If you only know the Romanized names, then like of your family members or your village, it can be really difficult. But what came in handy with that was some of the CI documents, which have family members' names in Chinese, headstones, that kind of thing. There's a site called Village DB that's really good. you can, if you have a kind of Romanized name, you can try to search it in Village DB, and it will give you a link and coordinates on the map to where the location of the village is, although it's not. Sometimes you might just have a romanization that's not going to be in Village DB, which can be difficult. And again, that's where Celia's team and having people who knew the dialects were super, super helpful. In terms of other resources, I think that just being able to have the space and the time to do research on your own and get prepared for it was super, super helpful. I honestly wish I had been more prepared on that end when I went, but my great aunt, who just is there now, she's been basically preparing for this trip for months and months, if not over a year now, brushing up on her Cantonese and Mandarin, doing all this research into it. I would say that the more kind of preparation you have, the better.
And maybe I'll jump in with doing what you can, and then that's separate from doing obviously what there's no way you can do. So if the language skills and things like that, as Naomi pointed out, you'll need help. So one, I know that someone's asking, hey, can we hire Celia to do this? The unfortunate answer is no. She's a single person, and so we've been really lucky and fortunate to be able to get the kind of help that she has given us over the last decade. I think one of the things that Winnie Kwan is working on is actually to create a way in which her expertise can be shared with as many people as possible. And that is in this kind of group way in which we're going to help. And this is where I think for those who are doing it on your own right now, what we want to do is be able to kind of not all be reinventing the wheel, so that we can share tips. And I would say that the English language surveillance records, and I'm going to use that very pointedly, in the United States and Canada are amazingly detailed because Chinese were unwanted. And so they tracked and interrogated and come up with all kinds of information about every single person who came in before basically the 1940s, both in the United States and Canada. And sometimes voluminous files, including, as Catherine Clement found, my grandfather's CI certificate as soon as we got them released for Paper Trail, the exhibition, through some political lobbying and pushing and requests. And it's the first time I'd seen a photo of him as a teenager. Every other photo of him as a grown elderly man. And so there's a lot of things that can be done actually even just in the surveillance records. And what that'll also do is give you details, and you'll get details that then make the detective work on the Chinese side much easier. There's no guarantee that you'll be able to find the village, the ancestral village you're from. But the more information you have about from the North American side, the more straightforward. And so we're thinking of it as a two-phase kind of research process for you, which is to try to, with help of others, to find as much as possible out on the North American side. And Naomi mentioned something about the village name. In the Chinese head tax registry, which you can find as an Excel spreadsheet, we'll provide a link at UBC's Circle repository. It took 6 of my students about 15 years ago. They kind of blinded themselves going through 97,123 handwritten entries, and it's digitized. And if you go through that, a single village may be transliterated into English over 15 to 20 different ways, because each person, as a clerk writing it down, heard it differently, right? So Baksa may be Bakshah. It may be Basa. It may be, so there's all these variations on a single village. And so that makes kind of English language searches in databases. So again, for a lot of the ones that exist right now online, but that still doesn't mean that it's not useful to go through there. But I would say if you're throwing in your village name in English, try every variation you can, because it may show up in the database in multiple ways in English. And I'd say do that. That's first phase, and then contact through Naomi or through CCM. And what we'll try to do is organize as well as possible all those who are interested to be able to do this. So you're doing it together, helping each other and giving each other tips. So you're not all solo detectives. Some of you may love being a solo detective, but sometimes a tip from someone else who kind of tried something and it worked really helps. Yeah, and I'll share with Rosalie some also some background, again, research papers that I hope will help you understand how people moved from these 8 counties over hundreds of years. And it may also, as Naomi was saying, so you're not projecting in what it's like to live in Canada in 2025 back into what life was like in 1925 or 1825 in these villages. And that sometimes really is helpful because the more you can start to think, oh yeah, it's really different there, and not in a negative way that you may have when growing up heard things about, you know, my grandmother's always go on Hyungha, which is what we called those areas that are the sticks, the rural. It's like, well, obviously we've escaped the rural backwardness, right? And if that's part of it, it's like, oh my God, there's squat toilets still and all these kinds of ideas of rural backwardness. Well, part of village life is very different. And that's the exciting thing. And I'd say as a last thing about if you're thinking about this, we can't promise obviously it's going to be as transformative as it was for each of the 4 people here, but it is transformative because you're starting on a journey. You know, you don't know where it'll end, but I have no doubt that every single person that's ever been on a trip that I've been on, they've been changed by it. And it's because you're on a journey. And once you start to take that first step, you don't ever know where you're going to end up. And if you're open to that, it is a transformative experience because you will learn more about yourself and how you've been shaped by those who've come before you. I mean, you're taking this journey in reverse. You're retracing the footsteps in the reverse direction as those who came to where you are now. And so that is by definition going to be something that changes you, because when you get to that place from whence they came, you will see yourself in a different way. And I think that is why I'm so excited that we've been able to have this conversation. And again, big thanks to the Chinese Game Museum and to Rosalie for organizing it.
And I think that's a really great spot to end the program on, because I am aware that we're coming up on 2 hours and there are some folks from the East Coast that are joining us, and it must be close to midnight, including for Melanie and Peter, our 2 panelists that are in Ontario. I'm just putting a feedback survey link in the chat. If you have a couple of minutes to fill that out, it's really helpful for our team to be planning what other offerings we can have for programs, how to improve virtual programs like this, what you would like to see from CCM. And I'll compile these resources that have been put in the chat and send those out with the follow-up Zoom email that you'll be getting in about a week's time, which will also contain the link to this recording that will be posted on our YouTube. So yeah, I hope that this was a informative, inspirational panel for everyone, as it was for me. And hopefully, if you are planning on visiting your ancestors this Qingming, take a photo of their grave and use that to be able to retrace your other ancestors in China. So yes, a huge thank you to all of our panelists, to Henry, to Jimmy, Naomi, Melody, and Peter for being a part of this panel and sharing your experiences. If you have any further questions, please send us an email and we can connect you to the panelists if you have follow-up questions for any of them individually as well. So again, thank you so much. Hope you have a good rest of your evening or day, wherever in the world you are, and hope to see you at future programs. Thank you.
Bye-bye.